So that's as far as scientific understanding and knowing is concerned. But what about scientific discoveries? Science has been a delight for the mind for 4 centuries. But if we want to use William James's expression, throughout all that feast, a skull has been grinning in at the banquet. A sadness has accompanied science. Another kind of sadness, perhaps, than we experienced before science. But it's a sadness nonetheless. And most good scientists have a tinge of sadness, I think. The best book I've ever read on that is by the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Stephen, I forget his name right now, on a blank, senior moment. And he realizes that in order to really appreciate his own discipline, he has to allow himself a little bit of sadness. But the best example I've seen recently of that was in the New York Times about a year and a half ago. Maybe some of you read this article in the science section of the New York Times, an article by Dennis Overby, who's their resident journalist in cosmology and a very, very good writer. I've learned so much from reading him over the years. But in this essay, which is a very powerful essay, in May 2023, I think it was, he wrote, somewhere in the universe, in the cosmic future, there will be a final thought. When I heard this statement, he said, quoting another astronomer, it broke my heart. It was the saddest, loneliest idea I had ever contemplated. I thought I was aware and knowledgeable about our shared cosmic predicament. I thought I had made some kind of intellectual peace with that. Then he goes on to say, but this was an angle I hadn't thought of before. At some point in the future, there will be somewhere in the universe where there will be a last sentient and conscious being and a last thought. How does he know? Because of the laws of physics, the laws of thermodynamics in particular. In particular, the second law of thermodynamics, which maintains that the amount of energy available to bring about complexity that's necessary to have thoughts, the biological complexity of nervous systems and brains that have brought this wondrous creation of the cosmos called thought or consciousness or mind into existence. In order to have that happen in a sustained way, there has to be a sustained amount of energy holding it up. But science knows that overall in any closed system, the trend is from order or complexity or ordered complexity to increasing amounts of disorder. And entropy is the name of the measure of the amount of energy no longer available to sustain complexity, and especially to sustain life and thought. It's going to be a long time before it runs out, but inevitably it will run out. And when it runs out, even if it's trillions of years from now, it's sad that thought, which is brought about by this cosmic story that we've learned about only in the 20th century, thought will be over. And since we value thought so much, since Overby values his own thought in writing this sad essay, it will be a very sad thing to lose something so valuable. And he can't accept it. So this is what I mean by this sadness. And there are many, many other versions of sadness brought about by science. I'll give a couple others later on. So even what we value most, consciousness, is doomed. How do you reconcile yourself with that? As I was reading Overby's essay in the New York Times, I recalled some passages that I had read, fortunately, from Teilhard de Chardin for many years, over and over. And one of them is, promise the earth 100 million more years of continued growth. If he were here today, he would say, promise the universe or the multiverse, billions and trillions of years of more growth in complexity. If, Teilhard says, at the end of that period, it is evident that the whole of consciousness or thought must revert to zero, as Overby is saying it will, without its secret essence being guarded anywhere at all. And later on, I want to talk, if I get that far, about what this secret essence is and how it might be garnered. Teilhard does not say a whole lot about this, but I've given a lot of thought to it over the years, and I've read a lot of other people other than Teilhard who've given me some ideas on this. But it's an interesting thought. Will we even get up the gumption to do anything if we really believed in our heart of hearts that it's all going to be zero? It's going down the abyss of nothings. If we'd really believe that, Teilhard says, we shall lay down our arms. Fortunately, most of us do not believe that, and especially scientists. But how do they justify their optimism, their enthusiasm about getting to work, going to the lab every day, doing things to preserve life and preserve mind, if they really believed it's all going to go down the pit in the end anyway? He says, Teilhard says, the prospect of a total death, which is what we're talking about here, will, I warn you, when it has become part of our consciousness, that is when we really believe it, it would immediately dry up in us the springs from which our efforts are drawn. I know that not everybody agrees with that, but I want to see what Teilhard is talking about here and what justifies the claims that he's just made. How can we sustain, he's asking, human effort, moral action, work, productivity, science, creativity, the educational processes that we put so much energy into? How can we sustain all that? And can we do so reasonably? Or are we being unreasonable when we do that? He tells us, in effect, you look at all of his writings, he talks a lot about the zest for living. And he believes that we can sustain moral activity and other kinds of effort only, we can do it well and persistently, only if we, first of all, have a zest for living. Not a commandment by God planted in our heart, as Kant and other philosophers have believed, that that's enough to behave ourselves, to do our duty. That's not enough for Teilhard. You won't do your duty well unless you first have a zest for living. You won't have the incentive to get up day after day and work at an enterprise which you think is ultimately futile. So the zest for living itself then points to something prior to that. It requires a universe in which there is room for what Teilhard calls more and fuller being, which is an expression for hope. Hope is the expectation of more, fuller, and new being. So that's the necessary condition for zest. But to have room for more and fuller being in which you exercise your creativity enthusiastically requires that you have a sense that something really big is taking shape up ahead. I'm given to think that when Jesus first came into his public ministry, his first words were not about duty or not about doing this and that, but his first claim was something really big is coming. And it's against that background that he issues the specifics of Christian morality. Something big is coming. Teilhard thought that we've lost that. It's been excised from our religious education, our homilies, and our theologies. And we'll see what exorcised this idea, this enthusiasm, this zest from our faith in a few moments. But in order to have room for more and fuller being, we need a universe that's still unfinished, that still has room to awaken. And that's exactly the universe that 20th century science has given us, and the theology did not. This is why science is so important for this man, so important for faith, so important for theology, so important for the question, is there reason for hope? It was in the 19th century that geology gave us a sense that Earth has a history. And it was in 1859 that Darwin published The Origin of Species, telling us that life has a history, a long, long history, and biology just expanded on that story up until today. It's one of the most fascinating stories out there, story of evolution. But in the 20th century, because of this scientist named Einstein, and because of his equations, more than his own thoughts and feelings, Einstein gave us the basis for the idea that the universe, the whole universe, is a long story, which we'll come back to in a moment. So in that context, faith in an indestructible goal for this process is a postulate of effective action. Teilhard does not try to prove that there is this indestructible cosmic goal. He posits it, he postulates it, because otherwise our human activity, especially our enthusiastic activity, would have no basis. Just as in Immanuel Kant's philosophy, some of you might remember, Kant tried to make sense of the fact that we feel duty in our moral lives. And Kant concluded that we can't make sense of that feeling of duty unless there exists a universal transcendent standard of right and wrong. So duty doesn't prove the existence of God, but it postulates the existence of God in Kant. In a similar way, for Teilhard, the zest for living and effective action postulates that the universe has a goal, and that believing this goal is not going to distract us from our earthly tasks, as many 19th century atheists accused religion of doing. But if we can have a sense of a goal for the universe, it could actually contribute more to moral incentive, to the improving of the earth. And he gave the name Omega, which is the last letter in the Greek alphabet. And he called it Omega, God Omega sometimes, and Christ Omega sometimes as well. Yes, he agrees that God is both Alpha and Omega, but God is less Alpha than Omega, in Teilhard's thought. It's a very important idea to understand him, I think. And he asks us to consider, what if the phenomenon of thought were perishable? To go back to Overby's essay. If at the end, annihilation lies in wait for me, Teilhard said, and he's got a lot of statements like this, it is just as though death were coming upon me tomorrow. If nothing of what we create, or even more, if all that is best in what we create does not win through the disintegrations of matter, then evolution, which has become conscious of itself in us, struck at its very heart by self-disgust, once it has these thoughts, automatically comes to a halt in a meaningless universe. So it's asking us the question that I've been trying to deal with almost all my adult life. is it reasonable to believe that anything can survive what he's talking about, death by entropy? If something doesn't win through the disintegrations of matter, he's thinking about the second law of thermodynamics here, then evolution is pointless. Then human life is pointless. Again, probably not many people agree with that, but to understand Teilhard's specific thought, I think we have to recognize this is what he believed anyway. And it raises a question in my mind, which I've never been able to have more than a few scattered thoughts about, is the question, what is the secret essence that he's talking about that survives the laws of thermodynamics and is garnered somewhere? Where is it garnered? So to summarize then, to have effective action, you need a zest for living.